Okay, please welcome up filmmakers Alanis Obomsawin, Professor Hayden King, and filmmaker Mike Mitchell. Please. It strikes me that some of those images could have been captured this week at Standing Rock. I mean, this is a legacy that continues to this day. What we see in these movies. For you guys, what is it like watching these films now? I guess for you, Michael, it's been almost 50 years. Alanis, almost 40. What's it like watching these films now?
I'm so excited to see him. I haven't seen him in 40 years, I don't think. You look the same, almost.
Should be on. Try it. Oh.
I guess you always find some humor watching, because if you have to look at everything seriously, you can never live another day and concentrate and assess what solution should be. So I watched myself as a kid up there, and I found a lot of humor. Some things I said, I probably didn't want to hear me say that again. But I know for everybody that's out there, you've probably been involved in taking some pictures or movies, and now you look back and you say, I don't believe it. But the things that I did see, that I take with me all the time, is many of the people that are there that are not with us anymore. Is that that blockade that happened in '69 was planned by the women and the elders. They waited until the men went back to work in New York and Boston, Philadelphia, and they didn't want to fight. For the first time in Canada, there was a movement strong enough that people would take action. It was a result of things that were going on in the United States. Black people were beginning to march. You could see it every night, and they were being severely punished by police. Students in university were marching and protesting, and I think it was Vietnam and other things, that social conditions, etc. They were being punished. And they knew that if the men had stayed home, there would be real bad physical things happening. And they said, keep in mind that you have to fight for what you believe in. You have to fight for the rights that you believe. And even if it's not recognized, that's what we have to fight for. And so, how do you tell that in film? So, I was a student, just fresh out of high school, and sitting next to a lot of elders, I began to understand what they wanted to display and then story that they want to tell. And the conflict was that the men were mad. They would phone from Philadelphia or New York. What's going on back home? They were watching on NBC, or every major network was broadcasting what happened at the time. They were mad at me for organizing something in the middle of the week. And it took a long time before I was forgiven by the men when they saw. I says, what would have happened if you were all home? So, and the other things that I see on there is that customs that is on there, Canadian customs, no longer is in Akwesasne. They moved it to Cornwall. The people who bring groceries back and clothing for their children from the United States, we don't have to pay duty and taxes anymore. I sat there saying, what has changed? Well, there has been some things that has changed for the better. And I went to the Canadian Supreme Court in 1986, fighting for our treaty right, Aboriginal right. By then, I was the Grand Chief. And so, Canada, the 5 government departments, Indian Affairs, Sol General, Justice, Revenue Canada, they said, there's not a court in Canada that has given any recognition of your border crossing right. So we'd like to offer you a chance to a test case. If you win in a Canadian court, we will sit down with you and negotiate how to modernize and apply your treaty right. So I took that message home. By then, mid-1980s, cigarette smuggling was going big time. And they were blaming the community, not the few people that were involved in it. And as we look back, when people ask, what was all that criminal things that were going on from your community? Those criminal things that started in Akwesasne were started by your most legitimate cigarette manufacturers in Canada. Your Rothmans, your Morier, 5 companies, and they would send their cigarettes to Toronto, to Buffalo, back to Syracuse, back through Akwesasne. And they use Akwesasne because the international border zigzags around islands. It's not a straight line. So it's no man's land for police on either side. And that was well known. And so all this that was going on, it took 5 years before it was noticed. So all I was trying to do was protect the community, again, for their own proper goods to cross, to be able to work, to be able to go to school. So I accepted that challenge. We went to court. Federal Court of Canada gave me coast-to-coast recognition. And so we came to the table. And across from us, where the minister said, we didn't know you were going to win. So we're going to appeal. I said, you never said anything about appealing. You said if you win in a Canadian court. Well, you want too much. So I went to 3 judges, and they reheard the case. And at that time, they shrunk it from all of Quebec, all of Ontario, and all of New York State. They said, this is our interpretation of your traditional trading and hunting area. I said, we can live with that. And then Christian, who was my first lawyer in his time off, is now the Prime Minister. Again. And so I thought it would be easier now. No, they said it's got to go to the Supreme Court. Anyway, to make a long story short here, I'll tell you what happened. The Supreme Court said Mitchell did not trade across the St. Lawrence River. We're fighting on inherent right, Aboriginal right, treaty right. And what we're arguing is, at that time, we did this practice of trade. There was no Canadian-American border on the river. I still cannot understand how they based that, but on a technical decision, they disallowed the decision of the lower court. It's not all for nothing. Today, I work for the national chief, and with Trump president in the States and across the border getting harder, I'm working with Canada now to establish a proper Indigenous border identification for our people from coast to coast, with the idea that they'll respect our border rights. So that's what I'm doing in my retirement. Thank you.
We talk about, you mentioned sort of some of the things that have changed. I noticed one of the things that hasn't changed is the Indian Act, which is mentioned in both films, is responsible for some of the conflicts there. What are we going to do about the Indian Act? I guess I'm wondering, from all of your perspectives, this is a piece of legislation that has governed us for, what, 150, more than 150 years now? A little less, I guess, slightly less than 150 years. How can we navigate through this? Like, what's the next steps with the Indian Act, which was obviously front and center in both of these conflicts?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, it's really interesting that both of those films, 1969 preceded this really important debate about what we're going to do with the Indian Act, because 1969 was the white paper, so the government wanted to get rid of the Indian Act, but it didn't have a plan to replace it with anything, right? So it was just going to throw it into the vacuum, and treaties and the original constitution would nullify any Aboriginal rights. And then 1981 in Restigouche, it's the patriation of the constitution is just about to happen, where Aboriginal rights are finally included in a concrete way into the constitution. So both of these events, I think, had political ramifications that would sort of solidify Aboriginal rights. But through it all, we still haven't figured out how we're going to get rid of the Indian Act. It still remains. I don't think we can say that it still remains in a universal sense, though, because there are many communities that are in modern treaties, and any community that's in a modern treaty, primarily in the north, is out of the Indian Act. And then many other communities are doing what's called an off-ramping process. So we think that the Indian Act is still central in our lives, but we have these pieces of legislation like the First Nation Lands Management Act and election codes and membership codes, and communities increasingly are entering into those and exiting the Indian Act. So the Indian Act is slowly, by piecemeal, disappearing from the lives of First Nation people, but it's not on our terms for the most part. I don't think that treaties have been recognized. Well, the courts certainly don't recognize Indigenous interpretations of treaties, and the Indian Act violates those treaty rights. So I think that there has to be a stronger push, and I think there is a strong push by activists and leadership to enforce Indigenous interpretations of treaties, but that's what has to replace the Indian Act, not this unilateral breaking down or off-ramping of the Act. And it's really simple. I think we have the principles. We have. It's really amazing to me that Canada has refused to sit down with Treaty 6, or refused to sit down with Akwesasne, or refused to sit down with the Anishinaabemowin Nation and actually had a discussion about what they think the treaty means. Like the interpretation of Treaty 6 is, here, we'll give you $5 a year and some, kettles. That's not going to cut it. For Nehiyaw and Treaty 6, it's, well, we agreed to share the land with you. You can have some grass for your cows. You can have some timber for your homes. You can have some soil the depth of a plow that you can farm with, and we can live in peace and harmony together, sharing the land. Well, no government has entertained that interpretation, and no court has entertained that interpretation. And until they do, we're not going to have a reasonable path forward post-Indian Act.
Alanis, I'm always struck when watching that film with, of course, your interview with Lucien Lessard, the minister. This time I just was distracted by his outfit, which was just awful. I mean, my goodness, what was he wearing? I mean, holy smokes. But that impertinence in the terms of his approach to you and the subject, that barrier when confronting Quebec officials in terms of sovereignty, the different interpretations or the hypocrisy of sovereignty, have you seen that change in terms of our government officials?
What I can say, especially about this community in Restigouche, it's changed a lot. They went from that, and now they are the guardian of the river. They eventually won what they wanted, and they received boats to do commercial fishing, and commercial fishing in a way that the community can benefit, not just individual people. So the leadership there was very strong. And they had to fight a lot. And you can imagine some of them went to jail because of Restigouche. And it became a very difficult way to deal with the Quebec government and the people of that community. But I'm very amazed. I made another film there, 2 other films with the Mi'kmaq people. And to give you an example, like how communities are next door to a reservation, at one point they learned that one of the community next door, they're counting the population of Restigouche as the population of the whole area to get money and to get whatever they do politically. So the guys from Restigouche, when they learned that, they said, okay, we're going to run for a mayor of that town. And they did. And it was, oh my God, I laughed so hard when I hear this story, because they went to the community and, voting, and you're going to vote for these Indian guys. And finally, they decided to stop using Restigouche as part of their population. But lots of stuff like that. And these things goes on, and the community doesn't know. You don't always know what they're doing. Now people are much better informed than before. But over the years, in every community has lost land because the community next door, they were smart politically, and they would manage to say, these Indians are not using this land, we can use it for this or that, and would automatically appropriate land. So that by the time that Kanentakeron happened, Oka happened, this kind of land taking had occurred for all the communities. But nobody knew, and there was not a resistance like what the Mohawk did. And by the time 1990 occurred, Canadians started to really be educated in terms of land issues and the people of the land. But before that, it was like, what are you complaining about? Like it was, Indians get free this, free that, thinking that Indians got more. And it's such a lie. I think now people are getting to be more educated. They're starting to listen to what the real story is, and it's very different. And I think that the leaders are more respected than before. They didn't have a voice, really. But it's changing. I see a lot of changes. And in terms of treaties, I really believe that there's no way out. Like eventually they have to renegotiate these treaties because people have been lied to and have been tricked. And look at the Chilcotin people like 2 years ago. They finally got titles to their land. It took them 30 years. You just can never give up. You just have to keep on, and generation after generations, and you see changes.
I talked about how these images could have been taken at Standing Rock. I sense the opportunity to take similar images is going to present itself, I would guess, this year, fairly soon across this country. You talk about, Alanis, the idea of renegotiating the treaties, or what is it going to take protest? Do we have to blockade more in order to get to this point? Because it doesn't seem that they listen to us any other way.
I think that you just have to keep fighting. Each area, each nation know what their conditions are, and how, if there were treaties, a lot of places there's no treaties. And where there's no treaties, they eventually are going to have to make treaties. There's no way out. It takes time, it takes generation, but people have to continue fighting. And it's going to happen. And there are some negotiations that are done in certain places, which is fair. But I think the leadership is very important in the nation itself to be able to really fight back and get somewhere.
The blockade is Indigenous diplomacy. And I think that if you look at any positive development in the relationship, and it's kind of ironic to say this, but any positive advancement for Indigenous rights to be recognized by Canada or the provinces has been precipitated by a direct conflict. And you say that these images could have been taken from yesterday. Well, it was just last year that the Heltsuk blockaded the DFO from Department of Fisheries and Oceans from opening the commercial herring fishery, what they said would not proceed because the herring stocks are in danger. And they succeeded in stopping the herring fishery and are working on a co-management plan. The Algonquins of Barrier Lake, you can guarantee there's going to be a conflict this summer over mining in their territory. These are people that have never signed a treaty. They've never agreed to share their land with anybody, share their resources with anybody, and yet conflict is required to force the province and the federal government to sit down at the negotiating table. So it is a reality. It is virtually a law of Indigenous state relations that conflict is required for progress.
Mike, how have you seen, as someone who went into politics, has the approach from the government changed? How much has it changed? You know, for the leadership now that are in your position, are they able to make bigger pathways towards progress?
You have the opportunity, and it just goes up and down. We just come out of the Harper era, so there's almost zero chance of getting any recognition. It's the attitude of the government. The states, you got Trump now, and it's gone right down. He wants to annihilate the tribes, do away with reservations. You're going to go through that. The reason I say that now is that you have a prime minister now who has said, I want to reestablish the nation-to-nation relationship with the First Nations. And what does it mean on our side? Colonial, Band Council, Indian Act, there's a whole agenda that has to be dealt with. But in that time, he also, on our side, we had to go back to school. We learn our culture, language, culture, tradition, because that kind of, with residential school, just barely a generation ago, the effects of feeling ashamed who you are, getting home, not speaking your language, not knowing your ceremonies, not knowing your culture, wind up on Skid Row, totally lost. You don't know, you look down on your own ceremony because you no longer have any respect for it. So nation rebuilding is putting all those things back in order, making our people feel proud again, and getting out of that whole era where you hate yourself because somebody told you to do that. Now, that's not politics. That's human rebuilding as a Gwehunwe. And so in order to do that, we had to take that one whole generation back and remake ourselves and put that value back into who is the Gwehunwe. Politics has an important role to play in, and our modern day politicians have to learn that. You can't just be lawyers, you can't just be schooled, you have to go back to school within your own nation and put that in order to be strong again. And so I see the damage that it has done coming back is also sitting across from your counterpart, and when you're talking nation to nation, we don't have that much land left, and so what are we going to do for resource? You can't be handcuffed, literally, not to be able to do anything. You have to be able to be given certain rights, certain authority, certain jurisdiction. And we have some experience. You have people now in British Columbia that have had their fishing rights recognized, and they're now working hand in hand with the commercial, with other people. And it wasn't as bad as everybody said it was going to be. And as far as Restigouche and others, Marshall decision, and everybody says, oh, there goes, everything is going down the tubes. It hasn't happened. And so it's going to be a matter of diligent work for all of us to show that we can coexist. And we have work to do on our side as well to be able to do that.
How do we raise these issues above partisan politics, though? Because, I mean, it is such a struggle to see advancements made under one administration. A new government comes in, and all of that can go away. We're seeing it south of the border right now. So I just, how do we how do we convince Canadians that this is a priority that goes beyond what political party's actually in office? You know, I hear it, but it's you know, my res is still boiling water after 15 years or whatever. You know, it's we're not seeing. I just worry that it can be lost in the swiftness of one election.
One short answer for that is self-government has to have constitutional protection. The rights that you're going to protect and live under, whatever jurisdiction factor under self-government, has to have that to circumvent the next government that's going to take over to say, we negotiated 10 years, but it's going out the window. So those are things that have to be negotiated. Lessons learned. What are the treaty rights? What are the Aboriginal rights? And when he says, I want to reestablish that nation-to-nation relationship, on our part, we have to be able to articulate how it's going to be applied, how we're going to coexist. You want to be respected at the same time that when you talk about sharing, and I heard a lot about that on there, but they never got a chance to show how they can share. Because right away, there's the judge up there said guilty right away. Well, the mood of Canada is they like to find you guilty first before finding out how do you establish that relationship. So there's still work to be done.
When Descahe came back from Geneva from the League of Nations, where he was trying to convince the international community that the Haudenosaunee should have statehood, you know, he basically had given up on state governments. He basically had given up on saying to the Canadians and Americans, we have these rights and you need to respect them. And he started to speak directly to Canadian and American people, right? The famous last speech of Descahe, which is a powerful diplomatic tool, in my opinion, one of the most important diplomatic pieces of literature or political philosophy piece of literature. The point is that he was speaking directly to Canadians. So he wasn't speaking to liberal governments or conservative governments. Their behavior has been consistently anti-Indian, not interested in justice. So I think that the films that we watched today, the films that Alanis directs and produces, the arts community, that is a language that I think is penetrating that thick consciousness of Canadians and appealing to that sense of justice, hopefully. I mean, every Canadian should just have to sit down and watch all of Alanis' films, basically.
I want to tell you something. This last film that I made, which is called We Can't Make the Same Mistake Twice, is the court case concerning the rights of our children, especially those who live on the reservation, to have equal rights for health services, in this case, and also education. I just want to tell you, in 1960, when we became Canadian citizens for the first time, we started to organize and we went crazy. We started to travel, and it was just, we felt so rich. We were meeting all these different people from different nations we never even heard of before. I never traveled anywhere besides Quebec. So it was just so incredible. At the same time, I'm told by several people, did you know that in jail in Canada, 68% of the prisoners are native? And I thought, oh my God, this is, you know, I wasn't aware of this either. So I start to go and sit in courtrooms a lot in Regina. I was touring in the prairies as a singer at the time, and just watching what was happening in the courtroom. And you know, you sat there, and I used to always sit next to a person that worked for human rights. And you sat there, my best friend, a lump in my throat the whole time, because you watch line up mostly men and some women. And somebody would read, blah, 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 you're guilty of this. And it was like, shut up, we know all about you. There was no respect towards our people, neither from the judge or the lawyer. It was like a factory. Okay, guilty, a fine, jail time, and it was so hard to watch, I tell you. It was just horrifying. And I did that in the Prairie, in Quebec, and in Ontario, in many courtrooms. So then I started, well, I'm going to start visiting my relations. They're all in jail, you know. So I start to go and speak and sing in prison in many places. But what I want to tell you, I am 84 years old now. And the greatest gift that I received was to be allowed to film in the courtroom, but to see our people respected, treated like human beings, and it's the greatest gift. I had never witnessed that before. I just want to mention it because I see many, many big changes in terms of attitude towards our people, from the law, from the judges' part, from the lawyers, and from the educational system that is changing now. We fight like crazy, and there's an interest to, in Ontario especially, I've been to a meeting where there was 500 professors from the university level, and what all they were asking is material from us to know what to teach concerning culture, tradition, language. The interest is changed. It's very different, and what's coming for the future is very interesting, because right away, once the Canadians are better educated in terms of what the real history is, and in terms of all the nations, it already, we see a change. There's a change amongst Canadians. Their interest, they want to see justice. And I want to mention that because I really have witnessed incredible things in the courtroom. And for me, I never thought I'd see this in my life.
I want to pick up on amazing Alanis, as always. Like, my goodness. I want to pick up something on what that Hayden said, which I do think Alanis's films, Mike, your film, our art, our stories, are so important to this process, because I think they need to know us in a way, and the stories are one way. And I think, you know, I'm going to see the Minister of Heritage next week, and what I'm going to tell her is that, you know, cultural institutions like the one we're sitting in, as well as all, have an obligation to feature these stories. It's the privilege of this building is built on stolen land and the oppression of people. And institutions like this are duty-bound to not only acknowledge that, but to start to correct things. And I think a big way is to create forums like this. You know, you see the Kent Monkman show, you see all these shows. The cultural institutions have an obligation, not just to Indigenous people, but all Canadians, to tell these stories. So I think you're exactly right, Hayden. We really do have to. Everyone should watch all of your movies, Alanis. It should be an obligation. And by the way, they're all for free on the NFB site, so it's very easy. The NFB folks are thrilled I just said that. You can find them all there, and I encourage you to do that. Do we have much time still, sir?
You know, I just
Yes.
want to tell you one thing that's funny. For the Restigouche film, I've had a very hard time to make this film. You wouldn't believe it. But the song in the film that you hear in French, Escaramouche à Restigouche, was written by Luc Plamondon, who's famous, just a wonderful artist and writer and playwright. And they banished the song. Nobody was allowed to play the song. Not allowed on the radio or anywhere. The song became something that the government didn't allow it. Isn't that funny? That's the difference now. You know? Yes. It's very different now.
Now, I mentioned that we were going to do something special after the Q&A, and I want to do that now, which is, if you'll notice on the credits of You're on Indian Land, Mike, you were credited as director, but that was not true until today. Mort Ranson, who's a fantastic NFB filmmaker and artist, had received credit for this film up until today. And we've now corrected that, along with the help of the NFB, who's been incredibly supportive of this series in general. All the films we're presenting are from the National Film Board. So I want to invite Leah up from the NFB to present Mike with a little gift for this incredible moment.
So on behalf of the NFB, we feel it is of historical importance to have corrected that credit. Our regret is that it's taken almost 50 years to do this. You, Mike Mitchell, and members of the Indian film crew, and of course Alanis, have built the foundation upon which we now have, the foundation for, rather, Indigenous cinema in the NFB and in this country. And for that, we are forever indebted. So it is with gratitude that I present to you this gift on behalf of the NFB.
Better late than never.
And now, Mike, I have to ask you the question I ask all filmmakers. When's your next movie coming out? Have we got time for some questions from the audience? We do. So if you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you, and you can ask a question or not. We can continue. Yes. Let's get a mic up there. Yes, sir.
So, Mike, what's your current thoughts and feelings of the border situation right now back in Oksustani? With everybody having to cross back and forth daily, do you think it was better before, or is it better now?
It's insultful. Presently, if I come from Snai or St. Regis, which is the Quebec side of Akwesasne, I still have to go through the New York State side to get back home. So after a long day, you've worked, and then you just don't go home. You have to go to Cornwall, because that's where the Canadian Customs Immigration is located now. Report in, so there's that long lineup. Mostly our people trying to get home. So after you report, then you turn around, then you can come back home. And when I said it's almost insulting, is that you're still attacking the community as a whole. You have, and I want to quote Article 3 of the J Treaty. It says, "It shall be at all times on Indians dwelling on either side of the international line to go and repass with their own proper goods, free, to be able to pass." When the Prime Minister Trudeau said, "I want to reestablish the nation-to-nation relationship," that's first on our agenda. We got to fix that. And in terms of how you fix it and how do you interpret that right to have, it says with your own proper goods. The thing they were really afraid of was the right to trade. You have the North American Free Trade Agreement. It's been in existence. Trudeau just signed a big agreement in European. With us, it's small. But if you got out of the Indian Act and you start really getting into nationhood, just look at in the United States the way they refer to Native American tribes over there. Sovereignty is a word that is used in every other sentence over there. You can't even say it over here. We freak out. So what do you put behind that sovereignty and jurisdiction? Because for us, we have to be able to establish our own economies. We have to be able to, we can't be given living on handouts through the Indian Act, because over the last 100 and some years, we've been in a welfare state. Look around in Canada, the way we're all in almost like in prison conditions. It shouldn't be like that. And so how does it affect us? And can it be a lot better? Sir, it can be a lot better. And it's not hard to do. It's done through sitting at the table, negotiating, and telling people how it's going to be done. And remove the fear and remove the suspicion. So I look forward to working with other leaders to go down that road.
More questions? Yes, let's get a mic for you so they can capture it for the cameras.
I've been reading in the papers over the last few years police brutality incidents in the Winnipeg area or the Edmonton area about women being assaulted by police and, Native men being assaulted also, especially even being left for dead in the freezing cold. What's the strength of resistance in the Indigenous, amongst the Indigenous Canadians in Calgary or Manitoba against these incidents? Is there unity? Is there any kind of resistance? Actions against that police brutality? Is it still going on?
No, I think there's tremendous resistance. You know, when Neil Stonechild froze to death in Saskatchewan after police took him on a Starlight tour, I think people really understood that, brought a lot into focus about the way that police treat Indigenous people. When Alanis mentions that 68% of inmates are Native people, I think the number is even higher than that. In Kenora, the Kenora provincial jails, 90% Native people. The relationship between Indigenous peoples and police is toxic. It is corrosive. In terms of Indigenous people saying that this is a problem, I think that that's a very loud sentiment expressed very frequently. It's fortunate that we have corrections ombudsman like Howard Sapers, who goes around and collects prison snapshots of prisoner demographics in Canadian countries, and so we have this data to indicate that it's such a significant problem. His last prison snapshot, actually, he took a snapshot of all the women prisoners in segregation in Canada, and he found that every single one of them, 100%, were Native women. The institutional discrimination in the justice system is I don't even have words to describe it.
I mean, the history of the RCMP was built as a military force to control Indigenous people. I mean, that is their origin. And that is, if you trace policing back in the States, it goes back to slave catchers. And if you look in Canada, it goes back to controlling the Indigenous population, making sure we stay away from the civilized parts of the country. So, there's not bad apples. The roots are rotten, to be honest with you. I don't know how the justice system was built to control us. It wasn't built for us. The police brutality is the system working as it was designed. That's not a broken system. That's exactly what it was meant to do. So I think it requires a complete rethink around the role of policing in our communities, especially when it comes to marginalized people, because the history is inescapable and unavoidable.
I think you'll see in the missing and murdered Indigenous women's inquiry a big focus on how police handle these cases. I mean, just the case of Val-d'Or earlier this year, dozens of Native women talking about how police are abusive towards them, and judges throwing that testimony out of court and not addressing it. I think it's a tremendous issue that has to be addressed. And I think there's a second part to your question that you didn't ask, and that's what can Canadians do? Because often I'm asked these questions as an educator. What can I do as a Canadian? What can I do? And I always say, turn the mirror on yourself, because it's not Indigenous institutions that are perpetuating these harms and that injustice. It's not the Indigenous healthcare system that discriminates against Native people. It's not the Indigenous education system that discriminates against Indigenous. It's not the Canadian criminal justice, Indigenous criminal justice system that's discriminating against Indigenous peoples. It's the Canadian ones. So that's how Canadians can help. Turn the mirror on yourself and attack those institutions and transform them so that they're actually just.
I mean, it struck me, Mike, in that protest, how many different police forces arrived. I mean, I saw OPP, the Cornwall Police, the RCMP. I mean, there might have been more. I mean, it was a remarkable out of force against an unarmed contingent. I mean, it just struck me, just the breadth of what they brought to bear on that bridge that day.
I don't want to switch topics here, but a thought came that I want to share with you. There's Indigenous people in New Zealand, and they have done tremendous work in sharing their culture. Now, I've been in sports all my life. I've been a lacrosse player all my life, and I like to see sporting events. So recently, I saw these men and women in the front, and they do this little exercise where they make facial features and they stomp their feet.
The haka.
The haka, all in unison. But there's also non-natives with them. And then when it's finished, they said this is a New Zealand culture that we're sharing. And they've with pride, they've enacted other indigenous characteristics, but it represents New Zealand as part of it. I am surprised that the game of lacrosse is Canada's national summer sport and so many few people know about it. It's just now, and because it's getting popular in the States, that it's becoming better known. But it has a deep culture. We call it the creator's game. And in that, it's the first and last stages in between of diplomacy. Many wars were settled through a lacrosse game, and yet people don't know about it. I've written 2 books now on it, and it's in a school system. So you asked what my next film is going to be. Might go down that road too.
We got time for one more? Yes.
Just jumping off from the last question, in your experience, are there, and specifically in terms of like land defense or civil action, are there best practices that work really well for the protesters, or are there strategies that you think should be employed that haven't been used before that would make it go a little bit smoother or more successfully?
Yeah, we've learned that all year with Standing Rock, where the elders led the protest, and they said the only way you're going to win is in nonviolent. And everybody who showed up there that had a gun in a trunk said, no, we're not going to use that because we're not going to win that way. And then as it got bigger and more notice, etc., and everybody started realizing that the strength is in peace, through ceremony, expressing your culture, sharing it. And all of a sudden, it wasn't just natives, but they had young families from other cultures stood there and said, we believe in your fight to protect the environment. We want to join you. And so as the camp was dismantled, and you see people walking away, a lot of non-natives were walking away with them. And yet they've learned so much from each other. But the biggest lesson that I've seen, that it kind of speaks loud and clear, it was a non-violent protest without banners being let out. It was young people there learning a lot of native culture that didn't have to be flash, exorbitant lights, bells and whistles. It was none of that. They starved there. They had a hard time there. And in that hard time, they've learned many great lessons about how do you live in peace with one another. I think we're going to see more of that in other issues. But I think the lesson that we're starting to, because this is, you've all heard of Wounded Knee, Alcatraz. So every 10 years there's a movement. But there was a militant movement at one time, led by AIM, and they thought the only way we're really going to get our issues noticed, we have to be militant. We have to reach for the gun. Well, we found out it ain't going to work. We talk about the wisdom of our elders and our ceremonial leaders, and we reached out for them, and now we're finding out that we can take that a long way, because everything that they've told us about sharing was practiced in so many real ways. And so I'm a big proponent, because in my culture, they talked about a man that went around the warring nations who was known as the peacemaker, that now our young children beginning to find out who he really was. And it's almost something like a mythical, what do they call, not mythical, but a Jesus type of person that really taught good lessons about peace. There's Gandhi, there's other people that we admire, but in North America, there was an Aboriginal person that promoted a good way to live, respect your people, respect nature. And now we're starting to learn more, that our own people are coming forth and say there's important lessons here we can share. But to answer your question, that's the biggest lesson we've learned in recent times, is peaceful way of expressing yourself.
Alanis, Mike, Hayden, I want to thank you so much for joining me here today, for talking with us, and for all the work you do for our people in the past and going forward. Gchi'mnissing. The next edition of this is in March. Cindy Blackstock, the subject of Alanis's latest film, will be here to speak to Gil Cardinal's landmark documentary Foster Child and talk about the state of child welfare in Canada when it comes to Indigenous children. Please join us then. Gchi'mnissing, thank you so much for being here.
I'd like to say one thing.
Oh, yes. Go ahead.
I've seen a lot of Alanis's films throughout the times. And every time I see it, I leave with so much pride that I had an opportunity to tell you to your face how proud you make me feel when I watch your film. And I join with everyone else wishing that you're going to be a filmmaker a long time still. Yeah, I want to go on.
Thank you.